A year ago, the internet gave everyone the same piece of advice. Stop hiding your budget. Say the number out loud. Turn down the dinner, skip the trip, and instead of making an excuse, just say it plainly. That's not in my budget right now. It was supposed to be freeing. No more fake excuses, no more pretending you forgot your wallet. Just the truth, spoken with a straight face. And for a while, it worked exactly like that. But a year is long enough to see what a trend actually does to a person once the novelty wears off. And for a lot of people, something quieter happened underneath the confidence. The budget didn't just become honest, it became watched. This is what happens when a private number turns into a public performance, and what to do once the applause stops being the point. Picture a dinner table. 6 people, 1 check, and Victor doing the thing he'd read about, the thing everyone was doing. The waiter comes around for a second bottle of wine, and instead of quietly declining, he says it the way the trend told him to. I'm gonna pass, trying to stick to a budget this month. It lands well. Someone nods, someone says, that's honestly really mature of you. For a second, it feels like exactly what it promised to feel like. No shame, no shrinking, just a clear line stated in daylight. Then the next round comes. And this time, when Victor reaches for his water instead of a drink, he notices something different in the room. Nobody says anything, but he feels it anyway. The small, specific awareness that everyone at this table now knows the rule he set for himself out loud. Which means everyone at this table is quietly able to notice if he breaks it. He didn't think about that part. The trend never mentioned that part. 2 weeks later, at a different dinner, he orders the drink anyway. Not because he can afford it, because the thought of someone remembering what he said last time and watching him go back on it feels worse than the money does. That's the part nobody warned him about. Saying a boundary out loud didn't just make him accountable to himself, it made him accountable to an audience. And an audience doesn't just witness a boundary, it starts keeping score. The idea behind saying your limits out loud was never really about money. It was about shame, specifically the shame of having a limit at all. For a long time, the unspoken rule was that admitting you couldn't or wouldn't spend on something was a small social failure, something to cover for. So the fix made sense. Remove the shame by removing the secrecy. Say it plainly enough, often enough, and the discomfort should shrink. For some people, that's exactly what happened. Saying the number out loud stripped it of its power to embarrass them. But there's a piece of human wiring that the trend didn't account for. The moment something moves from private to public, it stops being evaluated only by the person who said it. It starts being evaluated by whoever's in the room. And most people are far more sensitive to being watched than they are to their own private standards. It's an old, deeply built-in habit, not a character flaw. We regulate ourselves differently depending on whether we think someone's paying attention. So the private version of budgeting asks a fairly gentle question. Does this purchase fit what I actually want for myself? The loud, witnessed version asks a much sharper one. Will the people who heard my rule think less of me if I break it? Those are not the same question. The first one is about identity. The second one is about reputation. And reputation, once it's activated, tends to override identity almost every time. Because breaking a private promise costs you a quiet disappointment, but breaking a public one costs you a moment of visible embarrassment in front of people whose opinion you were already tracking. That's the piece that got lost in the trend's second year. It wasn't dishonest advice, it was just incomplete. It solved the shame of hiding a limit and quietly introduced a new performance in its place. The performance of being the kind of person who never slips. And performing discipline is a completely different psychological task than actually practicing it. One is about being consistent for yourself. The other is about not getting caught being inconsistent in front of anyone else. Left alone, this pattern usually doesn't blow up loudly. It erodes quietly in 2 directions at once. Some people, like Victor at that second dinner, start spending against their own stated rules, specifically to avoid the social discomfort of being seen holding to it too rigidly, worried that saying no twice in a row makes them look cheap or dramatic, or like they're making the whole table uncomfortable. The rule they announce to feel free of judgment becomes the very thing they break to avoid judgment. Others go the opposite direction and get stricter than they actually need to be, not because the math demands it, but because backing off in front of witnesses would feel like public failure. The boundary stops flexing with real circumstances, a legitimate exception, a one-time event worth the money, because flexibility now reads as weakness to an audience that's mentally logging the rule. Either way, the actual financial decision gets replaced by a social one, and a budget that's being managed for an audience's approval instead of your own actual numbers isn't really a budget anymore. It's a character you're maintaining. Characters are expensive to keep up, and they don't leave much room for the ordinary, boring flexibility that real financial life requires. The fix isn't to go back to hiding your budget. Privacy and secrecy aren't the same thing. And the shame the trend was originally responding to was real. The fix is separating two things the trend collapsed into one: the accountability that actually helps you and the audience that doesn't. Here's a workable way to do that. Start with a private ledger before any public boundary exists. Before you say a limit out loud to anyone, define it clearly to yourself first. A specific number for a specific category over a specific stretch of time, not a vague feeling of trying to save more. A real number you could write down. This matters because the version of the boundary that lives only in your head, decided under no social pressure, is the one that actually reflects your real priorities. If the first time you define your limit is out loud at a dinner table, you're not setting a boundary. You're improvising one in front of witnesses, which means the witnesses end up shaping it more than your own math does. Pick one person, not a room. The genuine value of saying it out loud isn't the audience size. It's having a single point of real accountability. Choose one person whose opinion you trust and who won't turn your limit into a running commentary. A partner, a close friend, a sibling. Tell them the actual number and the actual reason. That's a check-in relationship. A table of 6 acquaintances hearing you decline a drink isn't accountability. It's an audience, and audiences respond to performance, not honesty. Externalize the decision, not the number. In public, in the moment, you don't need to announce your budget to explain a no. That's not for me tonight. Carries the same boundary as I'm on a budget, without turning your finances into shared information that now 6 people have opinions about. You get the benefit the trend promised, no fake excuses, without the side effect of a scoreboard. Build in a real review on a schedule you control. Once a week or once a month, sit down with your one accountability person and actually look at whether the boundary held and why, without an audience watching it happen in real time. This is where the actual learning happens, not in the split-second social moment at the table, but in the calm, private follow-up where you can be honest about a slip without performing anything for anyone. None of this requires you to go back to hiding. It just moves the accountability to where it actually functions, a relationship built for honesty instead of a room built for impressions. A few months after that second dinner, Victor tries it differently. He picks one person, his brother, and tells him the real number, what he's trying to keep his monthly going out spending under, and why, plainly, no performance attached. The next time a group dinner rolls around, he doesn't announce anything at the table. When the second bottle comes around, he just says, he's good, thanks. No explanation, no declaration of a rule for 6 people to remember. Nobody clocks it as anything. It's just a no, the same as any other no. 2 weeks later, there's an exception worth making, a close friend's birthday, a genuinely rare night. Victor goes over his usual limit on purpose, tells his brother about it at their next check-in, and explains why. His brother doesn't treat it as a failure because it was never a rule performed for an audience. It was a real decision made by someone who actually knows the full picture, reviewed calmly instead of judged in the moment. The boundary still exists. It's just no longer a character Victor has to keep playing in front of people who were never actually invested in his numbers to begin with. It's a private commitment, checked by one real relationship, flexible enough to bend when bending makes sense. And that flexibility doesn't feel like failure anymore because there's no audience left to disappoint. The instinct behind saying your limits out loud was never wrong. Shame around money is real, and quietly hiding it usually makes it heavier, not lighter. But there's a difference between being honest about money and performing your discipline for whoever happens to be listening. Honesty is something you can practice alone, in a ledger nobody else reads, in a decision nobody else has to approve of first. Performance needs a crowd, and a crowd, no matter how supportive, is watching for a story, not tracking your actual numbers. The healthiest version of financial accountability isn't loud. It's not silent either. It's specific. One honest relationship, a real number, a private check-in, and a boundary that's allowed to flex without an audience deciding what that flexibility means about your character. Money handled that way doesn't need applause to hold steady. It just needs to be true.